So I'm really here to talk about film marketing strategies. Maybe to start, I say a few words about myself and about my company. I'm originally Swiss and Finnish. I grew up in the French part of Switzerland in a small city called Lausanne. Then I actually kind of traveled and worked in several European countries, and nowadays I ended up in Berlin, so that's where I'm based now. I've always been very interested in marketing because I think that, or in film marketing, because I feel like the world of production and the world of distribution are two worlds that don't always communicate very well together and don't necessarily always understand each other very well. And I feel that marketing is the common language that can actually make these two words communicate and work better together. And so that's what I've always been interested in. It's kind of being a little bit that missing link that can help those kind of films that I love, those kind of films that were made with passion and not necessarily with the market in mind, and helping those kind of films to actually find an audience and get seen by people. And so that's why I started this company back in 2011 called Alphapanda. I was based in London at the time. And today we have a little bit, there's a team of 5 at Alphapanda. We spread all around Europe. So one colleague is in Warsaw, one is in Geneva, and one is in Barcelona, and there's 2 of us in Berlin. We have one foot with the bad guys and one foot with the good guys. We work with 20th Century Fox and Warner Bros. We do social media marketing for them. But then we also work on documentaries and fiction projects, let's say independent documentaries and fiction projects here in Europe, mostly festival films and things like that. And we do both kind of traditional marketing, so really working with producers on their kind of marketing strategies, and social media marketing. So today my presentation is going to be focused more on let's say, the marketing strategy, so really more like the traditional side of how to put together a strong marketing strategy for a film. But at the end, I will show you a case study that kind of illustrates how having a strong marketing strategy in place at the beginning of the process, at the time of production, really kind of facilitates the work that is done later than when it actually comes to releasing the film. Or at least hopefully that case study will illustrate that. The first concept, whenever we talk about marketing, the key and most important concept to kind of keep in mind is the audience journey. What's really great when we do marketing for films is that all of us have been like hundreds of times in the other position, which means not in the position of the marketeer, of the marketing person who needs to kind of create an audience journey, but actually in the position of someone who actually decides to go and watch a film, or who most of the times decides not to go and watch a film. And so whenever we think about marketing, we need to kind of create that thing that is called an audience journey that's basically going to take our viewers from the point where they have never heard about a film in their life to the point where they actually decide to go and see the film, whether that's in a cinema, on VOD, DVD, whatever, but actually kind of making an active decision to go and watch that film. According to certain marketing research, and that's not specific to film, that's kind of marketing in general, they say that in order for someone to kind of remember a message, you need 7 points of contact with that message. So that would suggest, in terms of film, that in order for you to kind of remember a film, you need to kind of come across that film 7 times. So you're walking on the street, you bump into a poster, then you see the name of a film in a festival catalog, then you watch the trailer online, then you talk about a film with a friend of yours. All of these are kind of touching points, and if you have these 7 points of contact, then you kind of remember that message. I don't know if that's really true, if it's 5, if it's 4, if it's 9, but all I know is that you need to have like several points of contact in order to remember a film. And so whenever we work on the marketing of a film, the idea is to create a strategy that will kind of give these several points of contact so that the audience will kind of go on this journey. What's important also to understand when we think about an audience journey is that you're never going to get like everyone on board with you on a train to actually come and decide to watch a film. So of course you need to kind of have identified a target audience and to say, okay, these are the people that I'm going to try to get on my audience journey. And then what is also very important, and what I'm going to be talking through this whole presentation, is also the fact that whenever you create an audience journey, you need to make sure that all these different points of contacts, they're always giving the same message. Because if the different points of contacts are giving different messages, then you can easily create something that is confusing. And normally when the message is too confusing, then the result of the audience journey is that people kind of drop out at some point. So, so in order to maybe illustrate this example of this concept of audience journey, I'm going to take you through an audience journey that I took a year and a half ago. I was at the Locarno Film Festival. I had some time to watch a film. And so I decided to go and watch a film. There were several films that were available at that specific time, but this is one of the ones that intrigued me. So, you know, this is my first point of contact. All I have is a title, a translation of the title, and 3 images. So let's play a game. What do you think is the nationality of the game, of the film? If anyone knows this film, please don't answer because it's not fun. But for those who don't know this film, what do you think is the nationality of the film? Argentina. Poland? More Europe or Asia, or it's a bit unclear. Okay, nobody seems to be. Georgia, maybe? Ukraine? Okay, Eastern Europe, something. What do you think is the genre of the film? Drama? Everyone? Thriller, horror. Okay. So you see, like, just based on these few images and on this title, we're already kind of starting to create an image in our head. I had no idea where the film was from, I have to say, but I was also thinking somewhere Eastern Europe, but it's not Slavic. And me personally, I was imagining like quite a, let's say, elevated genre film, as we call them. So, you know, a bit of an art house horror or art house thriller. Okay, so just based on this information, who wants to know more about the film, and who says, okay, this film is not for me, I don't care? Who wants to know more? Who says, I don't care, it's not for me? Okay, so 2/3, 1/3. I was in the, you know, I wanted to know more, so I move on. This is the next point of contact. So synopsis, a 50-year-old housewife, Manana, struggles with a dilemma. She has to choose between her family life and a love for writing she has repressed for years. When she finally decides to follow her passion, she's ready to sacrifice everything for it, mentally and physically. And then we know that the film is from Georgia, so congratulations to whoever said that. Do you still feel like it could be a thriller or horror, or do you feel it's more drama? It's quite drama and thriller. I mean, for me personally, you know, when I see this, I chose this example. I mean, what happened for me is when I got to that point, I read the synopsis, and then I said, okay, this film is not for me, actually. So I dropped out. Because initially I thought, oh, it looks like an art house genre film. It could be something a bit different. And then I read this, and I was like, oh, it's a bit like a film that I have seen 20 times, you know, a woman struggling with a passion for writing and blah, blah, blah. So but you know, it's my personal taste. That's not very important. But for me, this is an example of audience journey, of a marketing strategy that's not very solid, because for me, the different elements that we have are giving us quite different messages, and therefore I end up being a bit confused. And when I'm confused, I drop out. So, you know, it's just, it's a very, very basic and simple consumer journey, but it's just to give you the you know, an idea, an illustration of one very simple one that I took myself, and that has as a result not to go and watch the film. So, so obviously what we need to do when we think about marketing a film is to create an audience journey that works, where people kind of end up going and watching the film. And so whenever we get involved in a film and whenever we get hired to kind of work on a marketing strategy for the film, we always try to think about like all these 3 elements at the same time. So, you know, the first step is really to establish a strategy for the film. I mean, the way we normally do that is that we sit together with the producer, with the director, possibly with 1 or 2 bottles of wine. And we just kind of start brainstorming quite randomly, quite openly, and then little by little we kind of define the strategy a bit more. So, the first step is to think about the strategy, what's the genre, what's the positioning, who is the target audience, what are our benchmarks for the film, and that's everything that I'm going to be talking about today. And then based on that strategy, you can elaborate, you can create like all the promotional assets, so, the film stills, the synopsis, trailer, poster, website, blah, 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 and activities. And the reason why I have a little arrow that's going back is that sometimes once you start kind of planning your activities and planning your assets, you realize that maybe the strategy that you had thought about is a bit too complicated or too expensive to implement, and then you can go and re-establish the strategy. So it's always good to think about like a strategy and then kind of turn it into practice before you kind of finalize it. So, marketing strategy. Whenever we create a marketing strategy, the first step is to do a SWOT analysis of the film. I'm sure that some of you are very familiar with SWOT analysis, and some people are probably not. The name SWOT comes from the first letters of the 4 words. So, SWOT analysis is very simple. You basically think about all the elements that are important when it comes to marketing and distributing a film, and you just put them all onto one sheet of paper. So basically, we always start with a SWOT analysis because that's a very good tool to kind of go back to at any time during the life cycle of the film, and at any time you can just go back to a SWOT analysis and it reminds you of what are the key elements that you need to keep in mind. The idea here is that you divide your sheet of paper into 4 parts. Everything that's on the left, there are all the positive things about the film. Everything on the right is all the negative things. Everything on the top row is everything that is internal to the film. Everything in the bottom row is everything that's external to the film. Instead of kind of going more into detail here, I think the easiest is just to show you an example of a SWOT analysis that we did. So you see like the kind of elements that go in there. So this is a film called Touch Me Not. I don't know who's seen this film. This is a film that won the Golden Bear at Berlinale last year. Has anyone seen it? No? Yeah, okay. It's a very beautiful film. For those of you who are interested, you should watch it. So basically, this is a film. It's a first feature from a Romanian filmmaker called Adina Pintilie. It had a very long development process. It was developed over 7 years. It's a hybrid documentary and fiction, so some scenes are really like fiction, some scenes are more documentary, and it's about the search for intimacy. It's the story of 2 different characters. There's 1 woman and 1 man, who are kind of, both of them are kind of doing a research in parallel. The woman is kind of meeting and interviewing several people, like sex workers, severely disabled person, like different people, and they kind of talking about like intimacy. And then you can see that their paths are probably going to meet at some point, but I don't want to spoil it. But it's a very kind of, let's say, more experimental film. It's not a very traditional film. The protagonists are definitely not particularly famous. Let's say that we didn't really have like A-list cast to rely on when it comes to marketing, and the budget was around €1 million. And sorry, did I have the? Oh yeah, sorry. Let me show you the trailer first, and then I show you the SWOT.
Very strong defense.
All right. So basically, the type of for this film, the SWOT analysis, we had of course more elements, but I just put the key elements in there just to give you a little bit of an idea of the elements that we put in there. You know, we have a Romanian director. Romania is quite a hot country, so that's definitely a strength. She's a female. That's also a strength. I mean, people are looking for finally female-led films. There is sex in there. Sex sells, as we know. That's always kind of easier to market. The film has very strong aesthetics. Every single scene can almost be used, you know, as a photo in a gallery and things like that. So that's very strong, of course, for marketing. It's a very unique film that's difficult to define, but it's a film that's different from anything else that people have seen. So that's also something that's definitely a strength. The main weaknesses for a film like that, it's a hybrid genre format. It's always very difficult to market films that are kind of in between things. It's like dramedy. You should never say the word dramedy because people go like, oh, or hybrid, never do that. We have an unknown director, an unknown cast. The film is very self-centered. The director put herself into the film, so that is something that can be quite off-putting for certain audiences and certain people. You know, sex sells, but sex also doesn't sell, as in it can make accessing certain, for example, TV and things like that much more difficult. So it can, very often in a SWOT analysis, you have like strengths and weaknesses. You can have the same elements that are kind of both at the same time. Opportunities, they are kind of external things. So they are opportunities, they are things that could happen, or they are things that, you know, existing communities that are out there that can help the film and things like that. So in this case, there was a great opportunity for controversy, and that's exactly, controversy. So that's exactly what happened with that film. You know, the film got very controversial. We even ended up having an article for The Guardian when the film won the Golden Bear in Berlin. There was an article from The Guardian that said first there was the election of Donald Trump, then there was Brexit, and now there is the Golden Bear to Touch Me Not, which is, you know, quite amazing to put the three things on the same level. You know, the film has definitely festival potential, both for fiction and documentary. The film has a lot of niche target audiences. And then what are the threats? The fact that it's controversial, of course, that's a threat because you can get like very, very negative reviews, which is what happened. The risk of Marmite effect. You know Marmite? That horrible, yeah, okay. So basically it's a spread that you put on bread. It's some kind of a black, weird thing. And I don't know what it's made of. And, you know, Marmite is really either you love it or you hate it, but nobody's really in between. And we kind of identified the same thing with this film. There was a bit of a, either you love it, or you hate it. And of course, that is quite a threat, because that means that people who hate it, they really hate it. And in this case particularly, it was kind of a kind of white, hetero, 50-plus man, you know, tend to hate that film, and since they tend to control the film industry, it was not great, but whatever. And the fact that the film had been on the market for very long, and you know, the film industry can get bored of projects that have been on the market for too long. And so why do we do this SWOT analysis? Well, basically, this is in particular weaknesses and threats. They are the ones that are really interesting for us, because that means that when we work on the marketing of the film, when we're creating a trailer for the film, when we're creating a poster, when we're doing everything, we have to keep those kind of things in mind to make sure that we're kind of anticipating possible threats or possible risks, and that we're also not just hiding weaknesses, but either embracing them or facing them. And then, of course, like throughout the life of a film, things can change, and some elements can become bigger and some elements can become smaller. So here I'm showing you what the SWOT analysis looked like 6 months later. So, you know, we did the first SWOT analysis before the film even went to festival, and of course, after 6 months, it was very different, because all of a sudden we had won a Golden Bear, so you can imagine that is quite a strength. We realized that the hybrid element was very, very negative, and a lot of people were really criticizing that, and the self-centered element as well. And the film became extremely controversial, so it was good that we had kind of thought about that. The director was ready for that, she knew what to answer. But unfortunately, the film really didn't do very well at the box office later. So, you know, even though we had kind of identified possible threats and weaknesses, they were probably a bit too hard to overcome. And they ended up becoming like quite, yeah. So that's just an example of a SWOT analysis. So that's the first step. Once we've got the SWOT analysis, we move on to identifying the target audience. So basically, every time I meet a director for the first time, and sometimes a producer as well, we always ask, so who is your target audience? And normally the answer is always everyone, or pretty much everyone. And so that's why I like to define like primary target audience, secondary target audience. I think the way I like to define the primary target audience is, imagine that you have some water, and the primary target audience is the place where you kind of throw your little stone. And then from that place, you're going to have circles that get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And the idea is that all these people are going to go to the cinema. So when you define a primary target audience by saying females 40 to 55, it doesn't mean that you only want to get females 40 to 55 into the cinema. It means that you're going to be targeting those women first, so that you're going to have like more people coming to the cinema. But at least at the beginning, you know who you're addressing and you know who you're talking to. The primary target audience is always defined in demographic terms. So it's age, gender, education, income. Basically for, I would say 90% of the films that we work on, obviously not the American films, but the kind of indie films that we work on, it's pretty much always the same target audience. It's women, 45 to 60, high level of education, urban or semi-urban, relatively high income. The reason for this is that research shows that in heterosexual couples, 2/3 of the time, so 65% of the time, it's the woman who decides what film to go and watch at the cinema. And a lot of people go as a couple to the cinema. So that means that if you convince a man, he's going to come home and say, hey, darling, why don't we go and see blah? And she's going to say, no, we go and see blah. And then they go and see, the second film. So that's why even if a film is not naturally kind of targeted for women or meant for women, we always tend to kind of package and market it in a slightly more kind of female way rather than going for a male target audience. In terms of age, normally we talk about a 15-year gap. So, you should go for like 25 to 40, 40 to 55, blah, blah, blah. Why do we do that? Basically, this is who's going to, this target audience, this primary target audience, that's going to define all your main assets whenever you promote a film. So that means the trailer, the poster, the synopsis, the film stills. So even the way we like to work is, instead of talking about women 45 to 60, which can be a bit like abstract, we actually sometimes even give them a name. So you say it's Lisa. Lisa is 47. She's got 2 kids. She's a lawyer. She's relatively left-wing. She's quite open-minded. She reads this and that magazine. She likes to go to a cinema once a month. She's, and then it makes it so much more specific. So then at the time when you have to decide between 2 possible posters for the film, you can think like, which one would Lisa like the most, instead of thinking, which one do I like the most? And then that really helps you to kind of target your film in the best way. So that's the primary target audience, and then we have the secondary target audiences. They can be either a larger group or they can be market niches. So typically it's people living in a certain place or who have a certain interest. Typical secondary target audiences can be LGBT people, people living in Göteborg and the region of Göteborg, people who like basketball, people who are into, fans of a certain actor, blah, 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 blah. All of these are kind of secondary target audiences. And those audiences, all your kind of marketing material and things like that is not necessarily going to be specifically targeted for that secondary target audience, but you can reach them through dedicated promotional channels. So for example, social media, or for example, you do an interview in a specialized magazine, or these kind of things can be ways of kind of reaching those secondary target audiences. So in visual terms, we have a little primary target audience, and then we have like all our secondary target audiences that can be more or less spread. So let me give you an example for this. This is a film, I don't know if anyone has seen this. No. This is a film. This is a documentary called "The Trial: The State of Russia versus Oleg Sentsov." I don't have the trailer for this one, but I can explain about the film. So basically, this is a documentary about this guy called Oleg Sentsov. Oleg Sentsov is a Ukrainian filmmaker who was who was arrested. Let me try to guess. He was probably arrested 5 or 6 years ago. He was sent to Siberia for whatever, like some kind of a random reason. And he was imprisoned in Russia. And although, I mean, he's quite clearly innocent, and kind of everyone knows that. And so there is this Russian filmmaker who decided to make a film about that. And it was produced by an Estonian producer. And they made a documentary about Oleg Sentsov, about the trial, and obviously it's quite a political documentary. And the documentary it premiered at Berlinale 2 years ago. It premiered out of competition, and so we were hired to kind of work on this film just before Berlinale. And so typically, like for a lot of documentaries, you tend to have quite a lot of secondary target audiences when it comes to documentaries. And in this specific case, our primary target audience was, a bit even older than what I was talking about earlier. So it was like females and males, 70%, 30%. So let's say mostly females, 50 to 65, high level of education. And so that means that, those are the people mostly that we believe will come to the cinema. The reality nowadays, if you analyze numbers of who is going to the cinema and who is going to watch art house films and documentaries, you realize that the average age of people going to the cinema to watch these kind of films is actually extremely high. And so, for a while it was like kind of 40 plus, and nowadays we even talk about like 50 plus and even like 60 plus. And it's true that the reality of, when you go to festivals and you look at people sitting in the audience, you realize that we're not even talking about gray hair anymore, we're talking about white hair most of the time. And that is kind of the reality of art house films. And it's true that I often need to have like long debates with producers and directors about that, because I tend, typically like when you show them this kind of strategy by saying, I believe that your primary target audience is over 50 years old, they always say like, oh no, come on, that's far too old, let's go younger, let's go 30 and stuff like that. But then the reality is that 30-year-old people don't really go to the cinema that much, and they don't necessarily go and watch documentaries that much. And even those people, like younger people, for example, students that can go to the cinema, they're not necessarily reacting to marketing activities that are, specifically targeted at young people. So that's what I always say when I talk about myself. When I was a student, when I was 22 or something, I used to be old inside. So I used to kind of react to marketing activities or strategies that were kind of aimed at older people, because I kind of saw myself as older and wiser. So that is kind of the reality for a film like that. We had a primary target audience of 50 plus, mainly female, and then secondary targets, male, female, 40 plus, political activists, film professionals, students, and Russian speakers. I mean, I wouldn't have film professionals normally, but because this film was, we were promoting the film at Berlinale, of course it's quite important to make sure that you create a buzz amongst like film professionals and things like that. And so in visual terms, that means that you have your females and male, let's say, 50 to 65, and then the other one, and then all the kind of secondary target audiences. Then, of course, what's interesting to notice and to think about is that once you get practical, and in this case we were kind of promoting the film on social media, then of course for us, like the secondary target audiences were definitely very important, because, for example, political activists, they are groups that will react to a film, like, that are maybe easier to engage on social media, even though they are not the only people that you want to go to to get to the cinema to watch this film. They are definitely a target audience that will probably kind of react more and act more as brand ambassadors for your film. So that's also why it's important to kind of differentiate between primary target audience and secondary target audiences. So we have a SWOT analysis, we have our target audience, then the next step is to think about the genre of the film. For quite a lot of films, the genre is very obvious. If you have a film about a father and his daughter and he just lost his job and she's anorexic, it's probably a drama. If you have like a group of friends who are kind of making jokes all the time, it's probably a comedy. But you also have a lot of films that are kind of in between, that are kind of can be pushed a bit more in one direction or a bit more in the other direction. And that's why it's very important when you think about how to position your film to kind of understand and think about like what expectations from the audience come and are associated with different genre. So here I try to kind of list, let's say, the most important genres, but of course this can be applied to any kind of genre. So it's on one hand you need to think about like what is kind of defining that genre, and then what are the audience expectations, and what is the audience journey associated to that genre. So first of all, drama is probably the most difficult genre to define when it comes to, because often you end up saying that a film is a drama because it's none of the rest. But I once heard a definition of drama, which I thought was a very convincing definition, so I'm sharing it with you. It's what defines a drama is that you have a main protagonist with a personal conflict, and whatever that protagonist, whatever decision they will make about that personal conflict will actually have a major impact on their future. So it's literally the image of the crossroad, and then you have to decide, like, the protagonist has to decide, will I get a divorce and pursue my youth dreams, or will I stay with my husband and be really unhappy? That's a typical drama. And if you have these kind of dramas where you have a personal conflict with a protagonist, then very often the way you kind of market that film is by creating identification. So, that means that you are, you're kind of telling your target audience, what would you do if you were in that situation? What decision would you make if you were in that situation? And that is often a way to kind of, tell the people, okay, wow, that's a strong story. I feel like this is engaging. I want to go to the cinema and watch it. If you don't have one protagonist with an internal conflict, if the internal conflict comes too late in the story, so there is a risk of spoiling your film by using that, or if the internal conflict is not very appealing for your primary target audience, then there is another way of marketing drama, which is by, marketing the story world of the film. So typically, like, films that are shot like far away in a, let's say, exotic place, or in a place that's different from yours, whether it's far away in a kind of psychological sense or in a geographical sense. Anyway, it's kind of, I'm going to take you to a world that is going to be different from yours, and you're going to see this is going to be quite a journey. And there, you don't insist that much on like a personal conflict, but you insist more on the relation between characters. A film that was typically promoted like that was the film that won the Palme d'Or last year, called Shoplifters. That's a Japanese film about a family with like all kind of drama, and that is the way like that film was promoted. Then about comedy. Basically, comedy, what do you expect from a comedy? Well, you expect funny scenes, and I know it sounds very stupid to say that, but you can't imagine how many trailers I see, trailers of comedies, or I read synopses and they don't even make me smile. And if you want to promote a comedy, you need to kind of promise that to the audience. And also when you think about the audience journey associated to comedy, people go and see a comedy because they want to spend a good time with their friends. And so that's what you kind of need to promise to them. So, it's in particular the way we promote comedies is we try to make people familiar with the characters of the film and to make them want to spend 2 hours of their life with those characters to kind of, laugh all together. And so that's why it's very important. I mean, comedies tend to be very cast-driven. It's important to have famous actors in a comedy, because if you already know those faces, you feel more confident to go and spend 2 hours with those people. And that's also why when you promote comedies, you use a lot of what we call character posters. So, posters that are introducing all the different characters. Romantic comedies, of course, you have some expectations of someone meets someone and they fall in love and blah, blah, blah. And why does the audience go and watch a romantic comedy? Well, because they want to spend some romantic time. So you need to kind of promise them somehow when you market the film that they're going to have some time, like romantic time, and they're going to see, what their expectations are. The road movie is also an interesting one because, there the expectations are to have some music, to have a journey in some kind of landscape, and to have like some external and internal journey at the same time. And so, that's also how you promote the film, by kind of showing images of like traveling, things like that. And then the last one is that I have here is a documentary. Documentary expectations from the audience is that, we're going to see true facts. There is going to be a description of reality. So whenever we kind of market a documentary, we're always kind of insisting on that. Like, this is true. This is something that is actually happening for real. And also, just to say a word about like promoting documentaries, when we market documentaries, it's very important to kind of talk to the emotions of people. People have access to documentaries on TV all the time. So if you want to get them to the cinema to watch a film, you need to make sure that you're talking to their emotion and you're kind of impressing them and promising them that it's worth seeing on a big screen rather than just talking to the intellect and having a very kind of intellectual positioning for the film. One great example, I suppose a lot of you hopefully are familiar with this film called Tony Erdmann. That's a film we didn't work on, but I think it's a very interesting case study when it comes to the genre, because that is the poster that was used for that film. When you see that poster, what's the genre of the film? Drama? Yeah. I mean, we don't really understand. It's a woman that is hugging. I mean, of course, for those who have seen this film, you immediately know what it is. But since marketing is for people who haven't seen a film, you see a woman who is hugging a lot of hair. So the poster is quite clearly telling us drama, and then this is the trailer of the film. Okay, so from the reactions in the audience, quite obviously, the trailer is clearly marketing a comedy, and I think this is from a marketing point of view, this is quite a mistake, because these two things are telling you very kind of different things and a different positioning. And then the result of all of this is quite funny, because this is the poster that was used in America. So, you have a poster that's a bit mysterious and a bit like drama-ish, and then you read like what's on there, and it says, it's absolutely nuts, hilarious triumph. And so and this is clearly kind of giving you something that's a bit kind of confusing or a bit like misleading. So I would say, that's why it's very important whenever you kind of decide to promote a film, to identify a genre and to understand what are the audience expectations associated to that genre, and to make sure that everything in the marketing says clearly, this is this genre, and that's how we kind of promoting the film. So we have a SWOT, we have a genre, we have a target audience. Then the next step is to identify, to create a positioning statement for the film. So there is this definition of positioning, which is arranging for a film to occupy a clear, distinctive, and desirable place relative to competing films in the minds of the primary target audience. The way I also like to define positioning is, imagine that you have two people sitting on a bus right behind you. One of them has kind of seen already marketing material and whatever is out there about the film, and the other one hasn't seen anything. And the first one describes to the other one in one sentence what your film is about. And that is exactly what we're doing all the time with other people's films. If we're talking together and I'm like, oh, let's go and see that film. It's the new Woody Allen film that was shot in New York. Well, what am I saying? I'm saying name of the director, place where it was shot. If I say, oh, it's that film about a trans ballet dancer that won an award in Cannes, I'm saying, protagonist, topic of the film, award. So, we do that all the time with other people's films. And so what we're trying to do when we market a film is to control that, you know, to more or less be in control and to decide, like, to try to influence whatever people will think and say about the film. And what's also important to understand when we, you know, when we use that example is to say, like, basically, people are going to simplify your film a lot. And so that is what marketing is all about. I always say that when I meet directors, you know, a director's job is to make a film that's as complex, as rich as possible, with as many layers as possible. And then the marketing's job is to do the exact opposite, to take that film and to simplify it to one sentence so that people can decide, okay, I want to know more, or no, this film is not for me. So, you know, it's kind of taking that very complex thing that is a film and just identifying three small elements, not necessarily small, but three elements from that film and using those elements and combining them into a positioning. And so this is a word cloud of what for me are the main elements that come into a picture when it comes to, you know, when we have to position a film. Maybe the genre should be even bigger here, because I would say that genre is the number one element when it comes to positioning a film. But it can also be the nationality, it can be the director, it can be the fact that the film won a certain award, it can be talent, of course, you know, if you have a star in the film or even a vaguely famous actor. It can be the topic of the film, but it's not all about the topic. Very often, like, producers and directors tend to focus too much on the topic, and it's not all about topic, it's also other elements. It can also be external elements that are not directly in the film. You know, it can be the location, and then there are lots of, like, smaller elements, you know. It can be a specific character that people really like. It can be the fact that it's based on true events, you know, that's a very important thing. Funnily enough, because you would expect people to go to the cinema to see imagination, but instead of that, they want to see true events. But anyway, it can be the fact that the film is a remake, censorship, you know, all these kind of different elements can kind of come into the picture. And then what's also really interesting when it comes to positioning is that actually the industry is not always looking for the same as the audience. And so that's why I created a separate word cloud for the industry. The industry is very, very interested in the director, much more than normal people on the street. Previous work, you know, that's essential. When you're pitching a film to a festival, to a sales agent, to whatever, that will always be the first question. What did your director do before? You know, what's their background? So that is something that's very, very important. Nobody on the street is going to say, like, oh, I'm only going to go and see that film if I know what else they have done before. You know what I mean? Festivals, they don't really count for normal people, but they're very important for the industry. And then, of course, a bit like the other elements that can be similar or less similar. So, so that also means that whenever you know, marketing a film, whenever you're positioning a film, you need to think about your positioning for the industry and your positioning for the audience, because very often those two are not completely aligned and they tend to be quite different. So one example, which I think is a great example of positioning, again, this is not a film that we worked on, but it's a very interesting example. Have people seen this film, The Broken Circle Breakdown? Okay, what is it about? Yeah, it's basically a film about a child dying from cancer. Sorry, I just spoiled the film for those of you who haven't seen it, but it's important for the examples, so that's why. What's very interesting with this project is that, of course, children dying from cancer, that's not the most appealing thing, and a lot of people are not necessarily craving to go and see a film about a child dying from cancer. So that's why, with this film, they decided to actually leave the whole kind of dying child completely aside from the positioning, which is quite a brave decision, which is also, you know, raising some ethical question, I suppose. But as a result, I mean, I didn't work on it, but from all the marketing material I have seen and from talking with distributors who have distributed this film, you know, the marketing strategy was more or less that they identified these strengths, like the music and the visuals of the film, the love story element, as you just said, it's a love story, and the characters. They are very kind of likable characters, and if you combine these into a positioning statement, that would be more or less a heartbreaking love story between Elise and Didier in a firework of country music and beautiful visuals. And so I'm going to show you the trailer. Will the circle be unbroken And I'm going to show you the synopsis of the film as well. The Broken Circuit Breakdown tells the love story between Elise and Didier. She has her own tattoo shop. He plays the banjo in a band. They bond over their shared passion for American bluegrass music and culture and dive headfirst into a sweeping romance that plays out on and off stage. When an unexpected tragedy hits their new family, it has a devastating effect on their relationship and lives. So this is just an example to show you like how much positioning is really about making decisions. I mean, clearly this is not a synopsis that is summarizing the film. This is a synopsis that is elaborating what has been defined as a positioning statement for the film. Every time I use this example when I talk with producers and stuff like that, and I discuss that, or I use that example as something that, to inspire them, I very often get like the question of ethics of marketing and, like, is this acceptable? Are you lying to your audience by doing that? Are you misleading the audience? Is it okay to mislead the audience? And I think that these are questions that are extremely relevant and that we are asking ourselves all the time, and I don't always have an answer to that. So my answer to that is to say, whenever you feel that you're lying to your audience, you're probably going too far. It's literally like a question of how you kind of perceive that. But on the other hand, of course, I mean, positioning is all about like identifying the main strengths and trying to attract people. And I've had a conversation with a few people about this film. And in particular, I remember a conversation with a girl who said she went to the cinema without knowing at all that it would be such a dramatic film. So she was very attracted by the positioning. But then she was very happy to see the film. So, like, as long as it's like that, I suppose the ethics of marketing are okay. But, of course, I mean, there are ethical questions that are raised when it comes to marketing, and it's not always easy to find, like, the right answers for these. So we've got our positioning. Then the next step is to do some benchmarking. So basically, benchmarking is about finding similar titles to the film that we are kind of marketing that can help us to kind of draft projections and estimates for the film's career. Very, very often you do benchmarking. I mean, people do benchmarking kind of all the time, but they tend to do benchmarking when it comes to the content of a film. So, whenever you talk to directors, directors will always kind of compare their films. So, they will say, this is I don't know, whatever, some kind of a drama. This is a Tony Erdmann, but happening on a small island in Sweden, whatever. This is some kind of a blah, blah. We do that all the time. But when it comes to marketing and distribution, it's very important to kind of keep certain kind of criteria in mind. And for me, it's mostly nationality. It's very important to always understand that the perception of people, for the perception of people, nationality is very important. And people will never kind of perceive a national film and an international film in the same way. Or for example, here in Sweden, you will not perceive like a Danish film or an American film in the same way. Because, Denmark is a closer culture, and therefore you kind of perceive Danish films in a certain way. So if I am in charge of marketing a Danish film here, I will need to kind of use some benchmarks that can be comparable. So that could be a Norwegian film, that could be a Finnish film, whatever, but maybe even a German film, but that shouldn't be, I don't know, a film from Congo, because that is kind of too different in terms of perception. In the same way, it's about always finding films that are similar in terms of budget, whether you have a famous director or not. What is the genre of the film? Of course, that's very important when it comes to benchmarking, and if you have a famous cast or not. Why is benchmarking important? I mean, benchmarking is very important to understand the international sales strategy for a film and the festival strategy, so you know how to kind of, where to bring that film and which sales agent to approach, which festivals to approach. Also to understand like how to position the film, often looking at what others have done and possibly what mistakes they have done will also help in knowing how to position the film. And of course for box office estimates. So, how much will the film make at the box office? And that will really kind of vary greatly depending on territory and purpose. So between national and international, you will often have like very different benchmarks. So let me give you an example. This is a film called Cobain. We worked on this film 2 years ago. It's a Dutch production. It's a film from someone called Nanook Leopold. She's a Dutch director. It was her fifth film. The story is a coming-of-age drama about a teenager who finds out that his heroin-addicted mother is pregnant. So those are the two characters that you see there. So the protagonist is a 15-year-old boy, and her mother is a kind of prostitute and drug addict, and she's pregnant. So it's a bit of a coming-of-age story because he realized that he needs to kind of take care of his mother and of the future child. And there is a very, 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 very violent ending with a lot of blood and drama, which is obviously something important, but also a bit problematic when it comes to marketing, because the ending is not really something that you can use in marketing. So that's the poster of the film. I mean, yeah, we got hired to kind of, develop a marketing strategy for this film. And so, we worked on kind of target audience positioning, and then in particular on benchmarking. And so we identify some benchmark for the Netherlands. So for the Netherlands, we only compared the film to other films from the Netherlands as well. So, only Dutch films. And basically what we did is we analyzed like the box office from the past 5 years, all Dutch films, like how well they had done at the box office. And by kind of doing that, we realized that all the films that were working well at the Dutch box office were either family films, and this was obviously not a family film, family as in kids films, and dramas. And all genre films were not doing well at all. And with Cobain, there was the possibility of positioning the film as a thriller. But, after doing this benchmarking, we realized that it made much more sense to position the film as a drama. And so that's, those were kind of the type of benchmarks that we were looking at, and that kind of helped us to understand how to position the film. For the international market, it was very different because, at the end of the day, we were more interested in seeing like which kind of festivals the film could go to and what kind of international career the film could have. And therefore, we took like all kind of benchmarks, all kind of films that were about young protagonists, so teenage protagonists that were quite art house films. And this ended up being like the 4 main benchmarks that we had. So for each of these films, we kind of analyzed what was the festival career that they had had, which territories did they get distribution on, how were they marketed, and how were they, what was the kind of marketing material that was used, and in particular at festivals and by the sales agents. And that really kind of helped us understand that, on the international market, the kind of young, let's say, raw or rough kind of coming of age, there is definitely place for that. So we decided to kind of position the film more in that way on the international market. So, so that's just like an idea of how to kind of benchmark and how benchmarking can help you kind of fine-tune and kind of, develop your marketing strategy. Okay, that's it for the first part. And now I wanted to move on to the case study. I don't know if there are any questions or maybe at the end or comments. No? Okay, so right at the end. Okay, so this is basically a case study that I have picked to show you like how, this is a film, the producer of this film approached us 3 years ago, and we developed a whole kind of marketing strategy for the film. And then this is an Italian film, and then we also kind of worked on the film at the time when the film went to festivals. So it premiered at Locarno Film Festival 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago. And then the film was also released in Italy, and we also worked on the release of the film. So this is an example of a film where, we have like the strategy that was done like very early on in the process, and then the kind of whole marketing itself and how it happens. So I think it's an interesting case study from that point of view. Well, I'm going to start by showing you the trailer. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the trailer of the film, the trailer with English subtitles. It doesn't seem to be available online. So I only have the trailer in Italian, but I suppose it's not that important. It just gives you an idea of the atmosphere, the type of filmmaking, the type of protagonist, and then I will tell you a bit more about the story after the trailer.
Sta per passare molto vicino alla Terra l'asteroide forse più grande di sempre a livello di quelli captati e
Pensavo che me ne devo andare.
Andare a dove?
All right, so basically it's an Italian film. Few words about the story. So this is the story, the protagonists are three teenagers. Each of them has a bit of a difficult social background. They have different families, but all of them has kind of issues in their own family and things like that. They grow up in a small village in, or let's say in a mid-sized village in rural Italy. They end up getting involved in a criminal activity. There's this guy who kind of gets them involved in this criminal activity, stealing stuff from churches and everything. And one of them dies at the end. Basically, it's a bit of I chose this film intentionally because it's a bit of a social drama that doesn't really know exactly where it sits. So that was not like the easiest film to market because it kind of comes a bit with challenges in terms of story. It's an unexperienced production company called Arti Culture, so they didn't have like a very strong production company behind them. They had done one or two documentaries before, but that was all. And it's the first fiction project from a director called Germano Maccioni, who was not famous either. And the budget is under €1 million. And then maybe a few words about the cast. Basically, they had two. Of course, I mean, that's a problem that you have very often when you have young protagonists, is that it's difficult to get like famous cast. In this case, they had two older actors in the film who are relatively famous, like not super famous, but relatively famous. One of them is called Pippo Del Bono. He's a theater director and an actor who's mostly known for theater in Italy. He does very, very, very arty kind of theater that is very kind of controversial and quite experimental, completely non-narrative theater, and it's very. I really like his work personally, but that's not very important. But let's say it's not like as narrative as this film could be. And then the mother is also played by an actress that kind of people recognize, but she's not really famous somehow. So, it's a typical film that when it comes to marketing, it comes with challenges because it's one of these kind of middle films that, you don't have like lots of really kind of hot things to market. You don't have like lots of existing communities to rely on. And so you really kind of need to, you really need to kind of define well a marketing strategy because this could be kind of promoted in quite different ways. So, we start by creating a SWOT for the film. So, the fact that it's a drama, it's at the same time a strength and a weakness, because of course drama is a strength because when it comes to journalists, critics, festivals, they tend to look more for drama, so that will kind of help us a little bit in the marketing. It's a weakness because when it comes to audiences, and in particular, let's say more kind of, if we want to get more mainstream audiences or bigger audiences interested in the film, having a drama is a bit more difficult to market. Another strength is the fact that we have quite young and cool protagonists. So in particular, if we want to go for younger and cooler audiences, we can a little bit play identification, the identification card with those protagonists. We had quite strong visuals. I mean, the film is very well shot. It has quite high production value. And they had a very beautiful film stills, actually, from the film, which was really great. We have music in the film. The music is made by a band. It's an indie band in Italy called Lo Stato Sociale. It's not a famous band, but it is a band that has, quite a lot of fans. And these fans are very passionate about this music band. So that means that, we have an element to rely on. And we have the actor, Pippo Del Bono, that I just talked about. Weaknesses, it's a coming of age. I mean, any coming of age comes with quite a lot of challenges, because the problem is that most of the time coming of age films tend to kind of be targeted for older audiences, and older audiences, you cannot make them identify with young protagonists. So that's always a challenge to kind of keep in mind and try to overcome somehow. Drama, as I said earlier, we have an unknown director, unknown producer, and of course the young protagonists are also unknown, so we can't really rely on the cast or the director and the producer for the industry. What are opportunities with a film like that? Well, the film is shot in a very specific region of Italy. People are talking with the accent and the, from that specific region, so there is a strong regional identity, and we can create something there in the region. And there are quite few niche target audiences. So, there are indie music fans or young people, regional people. These are all kind of target audiences that we can go for. And then what are the threats for this film? Well, we have young protagonists, but a story that's more appealing for older audiences. So we have an unclear target audience. Do we go young? Do we go old? The film has limited festival potential, or at least that's what we thought initially. And this is probably the most important one of all of these threats. The film is a bit too mainstream for art house audiences and too art house for mainstream audiences. And I have to say, personally, in my experience, that is a problem of a lot of films that we're working on, that they always kind of end up being a little bit in the middle ground. And this is always a little bit of a risk, because then you don't really know who you're going for. Like, do you really go art house, or do you really go mainstream? So, target audiences. We had two possible target audiences. In this case, as I was telling you earlier, often we work with these kind of things, what we call personas. And so in this case, we had two potential target audiences. One of them is Anna Maria. She's 47. She's a teacher. She's interested in art house films. She's interested in theater. So, she would be, let's say, the more traditional art house target audience. And then we have the younger target. He's called Raffaele. He's 19 years old. He's a student. He's interested in indie music. He's interested in film, and he's interested in politics. And so both those targets could be the primary target audience. So because we got involved with this film very early on, we told the producers, hey, for now, keep these both in mind. And then at the time of release, you would decide like who is the main target audience, who is the secondary target audience. But for now, make sure that you allow yourself both strategies, because this is something that could be useful for later. Yes. Do you need a microphone, or I can? Yeah. Oh.
Is it on?
Yeah. Yes. This is very interesting, and I think we all understand the sort of mechanics behind your way of thinking. But at the same time, isn't it possible to try and profile a film for some medias for one group and differently, so it doesn't get into a conflict in that sense? And also the same about the sort of artistic or art house film, as you call it. That is also, I think, what you want to sort of lift up on one side, and like creating two different trailers for different. I mean, is that possible? Because for me, that would be sort of make more sense.
That's exactly what we did, actually. We have a second trailer for the young audience that I will show you afterwards. No, that's exactly what we did. In this specific case, we went for, well, so I can spoil a little bit my own presentation. We went for, like, primary target audience was the older audience, but then the younger audience, we really went on social media for the younger audience, and we kind of separated a little bit the messages. So yeah, this is definitely something that you can do. You need just to make sure that that actually, you know, the messages that you're giving to both of these audiences cannot be conflicting too much with each other, because otherwise if someone comes across something and So, you know, as long as they're not too far away from each other, but you're insisting a bit more on certain elements for certain audiences and stuff, then yeah, definitely, that actually makes sense. But it's important to just not, to kind of, to have a strategy and to differentiate them. So, you know, in this case, we developed these two possible positioning statements. One for the younger audiences, for Raffaele, a film about 3 young men who are willing to escape from their own life with music by lo Stato Sociale. So, you know, we're really insisting on the kind of, on the internal, let's say, internal problem or conflict from the protagonists and the music. And for Anna Maria, for the older audience, debut film of Germano Maccioni about youth in suburban areas with a fantastic performance by Pippo Del Bono. So, you know, we're insisting much more on the kind of, the director, first of all, because even though he's not famous, you know, for art house audiences, the director is always an important element in there. And, you know, we simplify let's say, the story, the plot of the film into, like, problems of youth in suburban areas, and we're insisting on the cast because he can be important for those audiences. We did some benchmarking. This was specifically for Italy, so we looked at those films. They were all kind of first features from young filmmakers about young protagonists, and that kind of gave us overview of what were, like, the different films, how they had been promoted, and also which festivals they had gone to. And then, I mean, after they finished shooting the film, we looked at the stills, and, you know, they had kind of identified very clearly, like, the key scenes of the film in which they wanted to have a still photographer to get stills both for the older audience and for the younger audiences, So in this case, you know, for the older audience, we had stills that were insisting on that actor, Pippo Del Bono, because we identified that as being an important element. And then also, let's say, stills that were quite clearly suggesting, like, kind of art house drama, you know, and in particular, for example, the boy with his mother, that was an image that was used quite a lot in the press. And then for the young audience, we went for much cooler and slightly different type of stills that also allowed identification with those guys. So, you know, that's why we looked for images that are kind of zooming into their faces, or, you know, that is showing their facial expression to create that kind of identification. So we actually had, like, the material for both possible positionings, and so we were in a very strong position when then approaching the distributor, because that was giving the distributor more choices of how they wanted to kind of promote the film. And then the distributor created this poster, which I have to say I feel a bit disappointed in, because you know, when you have a film, when you have a title that's already a metaphor, so here is the asteroid, if you add, like, the little antenna on top of that on the poster, then you feel like this could be a film about space exploration, or I don't know. And he even looks a bit like a cosmonaut because of the helmet on there. So for me personally, I think the poster is quite misleading. But when we got back on board of this project, the poster had already been defined. So by that time, we couldn't really change it anymore. So, you know, once we had a long discussion with the distributor, and it was decided to actually use social media to approach mostly some of the audiences, in particular the young audience. So all the work that they did internally, which is press work and PR, you know, organizing interviews and things like that, they really focused on the older target audience. So that became the primary target audience. Anna Maria was the primary target audience. You know, they organized, like, interviews with the director, with the main actor. and this kind of traditional marketing. And then we used social media to try to approach kind of both target audiences, but mostly to focus on the younger target audience. So during the early campaign on Facebook, they actually used it as a platform to engage young local audiences during the cast and shoot. So at the time when we got back on board on the project, they already had like 2,000 followers on Facebook or something. So that's quite a good place to start instead of having 0. And then we used Facebook to target kind of both audiences, kind of both audiences, because older people are quite active on Facebook. People always tend to think like, oh, social media must be for young people, but that's not true, actually. You have like really all generations. We have even promoted things to 65 plus people on Facebook, and with certain success. And then the Instagram and influencers, there we really decided to go much more to, let's say, the top of the pyramid. So that means we went for very kind of a very specific audience. So that was, let's say, 16 to 18-year-old cool music fans. So, that was a very indie music fans. And that was kind of identified as really like the top of the pyramid, but we thought that those people were important because if we managed to get those people on board, we thought that they could then become like brand ambassadors for the film. So that was everything that was done on Facebook during the shoot. So that's a time when we were not involved, but they already kind of created, they casted through Facebook, and they also they were constantly talking about like the evolution of the project and stuff like that, which was a way of, already kind of getting the local community, because as we saw in the SWOT analysis, the local community was an opportunity, and it was important to get them on board. And then at the time of the release of the film, basically we used Facebook, as I said, to kind of target those audiences. In particular, we did a lot of Facebook events because young people tend to use Facebook events quite a lot on that specific target audience that we had identified. And so we actually created an event for each cinema in which the film was released. That's not at all something that we do normally, but in this specific case, it made sense. And then that's what you were asking. Basically, because the positioning was quite different for the younger audience and for the older audience, it appeared really useful to kind of cut a new trailer for the younger audience. When you go on social media, what's important to understand is that, first of all, the format is different. We talk square format instead of talking 16:9. And also the length is different because social media doesn't really allow to have like 2-minute trailers. They're too long. And it's important to keep in mind that very often people watch social media on the bus or whatever, so they cannot have music or audio. So a trailer needs to work even without audio. So that's why I'm showing you like the new trailer that we cut. All right, so you see it's very different. There is some stuff that is written directly on there so that even if you watch it without audio, there is kind of a message that's appearing. And it's insisting a lot on that specific band, Lo Stato Sociale, because people who know that band, they will immediately recognize that. And then, as I said, on Instagram, we tried to go for these kind of cool indie music fans. So my colleague Valentina, who was in charge of this campaign, she really spent a lot of time kind of researching that specific audience to understand like what kind of aesthetics they're interested in and what they kind of talk about, how they communicate on Instagram themselves. And so we created an Instagram that looked very similar to the Instagram of an indie band. And so in particular, this post here, I really kind of had to fight a little bit with the distributor to get this post out there, because of course when you tell a distributor, I'm going to promote your film showing just a white piece of paper with like a quote from the song that's featured in the film, they were a bit like that. But that ended up being one of the posts on Instagram that had the biggest engagement from all the posts, because it was just like, once you know your audience, you also understand like what they're interested in. What we created also was all kind of, this was, for example, the post announcing the premiere in Rome and things like that. Again, we got inspired by what our target audience was doing. So they're playing all the time between this kind of online, offline, what we call spiral marketing. So it goes from online and offline. So we kind of printed out all the stills from the film, and then we're kind of writing things and then taking photos of that again, which allowed to have this very kind of specific aesthetics that were very similar to what that specific audience is using. And then we did all kind of work with influencers, because again, like researching that audience, we realized that influencers are very important for that specific audience. And so when they shot the music video, that was the shoot of the music video, we actually kind of already invited 3 influencers to actually come on set. In this specific case, they had no money to pay influencers. Sometimes when you work with influencers, you pay them to do something. In this case, we didn't have money, so we only kind of invited people who are okay doing things for free. So that means like there were people who had like between 20,000 and 150,000 followers. And, we kind of invited them on set, on the set of the music video to kind of talk about the film, and then we organized a specific screening for influencers. And so each of the influencers got invited, got a train ticket, got 2 tickets for the premiere so that they could come with a friend and feel more comfortable, because otherwise they feel a bit lonely. And we had people walking around with Polaroids so that we could take like photos of the people, writing down the title of the film, and people could kind of take photos of photos so that they could put them into their Instagram, which is a bit absurd if you think about it, but as long as it works, it's fine. And as a result, we even ended up getting, actually some of the influencers who came ended up creating fan art. So, they were kind of creating art themselves in their own, on their own social media channels, where they were actually mentioning the title of the film here. So of course, this is ultimately what you're trying to reach, because then, the message, instead of coming from us, like as an advertising message, it was coming from other people who are talking about the film.
Reflection?
Sorry?
The reflection?
The reflection.
Something?
Yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely. I've just, that was my last slide for this, well, then I can move on.
So
yes, please.
Just a quick reflection. It seems that in this last case, you're very much communicating an attitude, the look, the sound of the film, but still, I don't have a clue what the story is about.
Yeah, but is that a problem?
No,
actually, I
just
think,
asking if there's is a conscious choice.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is, because this film didn't have a very appealing story. It's about like positioning is about understanding like what are the strengths of your film and how to kind of use them to attract people. And I'm sure that if you think about the last, let's say, think about the last 5 films that you went to see at the cinema, and think about the audience journey that took you to go and see that film at the cinema, I'm sure that you will realize that at least 2 of them, the plot, the story of the film didn't play any role. Because you either went because you really like that director, and therefore you want to see what that director does, or because, I don't know, it's a genre that you like, or and you would be surprised to see like how many films are actually marketed very successfully without using the story in any way, because it's not very important. Like there's not a single Woody Allen film that is promoted based on the story. You never say, oh yeah, it's a story of a guy who comes around and he falls in love and then he separates, and that's not how you promote those films. You promote an atmosphere. You promote a type of humor. You promote, like comedies very often, they're not promoted on the story, they're promoted on the kind of atmosphere. So, for me, it's quite a compliment to hear what you say. At least I take it very positively, because I think that means that we were successful at kind of creating the positioning that we wanted.
Did it work?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's always difficult. I mean, I've kind of stopped. For me, like I measure the success of our work by looking at if our client was happy, with our work and would work with us again. This distributor and this producer worked with us twice again after that, so for me it worked. When it comes to box office results, we had like the distributor had said like optimistic, realistic, pessimistic kind of objectives, and it was just a tiny bit below realistic. So pessimistic was 4,000, realistic was 9,000, and optimistic was 15 or 20,000, and they ended up getting 8,500 admissions. So they considered it to be fine. Yeah.
Do you know though, just another follow-up on that. In those figures, do you know who bought the was it Rafael or Ana Maria who went?
No, unfortunately we don't know. It's hard to tell. We tried to ask the producer because we were also curious. But they seem to say that it was kind of more older people who went to the cinema, but that there were more young people than normally. But it's a very kind of answer. So no, we'd love to have very detailed figures, but unfortunately they're hard to get. Any other comments? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for your seminar here. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little about how you're working in the European films and European market, how these films, the marketing is financed, and maybe a little bit of when do you want to see the project? When do you want the filmmakers to approach you with their projects?
Okay. How it's financed in different ways. As always with European producers, nobody's really spending their own money. Why would they? So there are certain countries where marketing expenses are allowed as production expenses, and so therefore some producers just put money on the side from the production budget or from the development budget to kind of work on the strategy. I mean, specifically, I suppose I can be quite transparent here. I mean, whenever we kind of work on a strategy for a film, normally we charge between 2,000 and 3,000 euros to kind of just create a strategy for a film. And then, of course, when it comes to creating a whole campaign, that's something different. But for example, this campaign for the Asteroidi, I think we charged 4,000 for the whole campaign or something like that. Plus, of course, advertising spend, because you need to buy advertising. So the distributor plus inviting the influencers. So the distributor probably spent like 10,000 euros altogether. So, we're not talking about huge amounts of money. So some producers just take it from their production budget. Some kind of agree with the distributor that this is an expense that will save money for later, so the distributor is spending. Sometimes we get hired by the sales agent, in particular when we work on films at the time of festivals and stuff like that. And also, I mean, in general, I would say marketing expenses nowadays are expected to be expenses from the producer. Even like 5 years ago, sales agents used to kind of pay for posters sometimes or trailers. Nowadays, I don't really know any sales agent who is still paying for these kind of things. So it's just expected to be a deliverable from the producer, which on one hand, of course, is annoying because it's an additional expense. But on the other hand, I think it's empowering because that means that you as a producer, you're in charge of the marketing of the film, whereas before it was more like distributors and sales agents who were in charge of that. So you're kind of taking some power back into your own hands. I don't know if you're a producer, but I hope. And when is a good time to start thinking? I think a good time to start thinking about like a marketing strategy for a film is, if we're talking fiction, it's when you have a pretty final version of the script and a clear idea of your cast, because otherwise it can be a bit too early. That's a good time to really elaborate a marketing strategy, so before you go shooting. Then, of course, once you have already shot the film, it's still possible to do some things, but it's a bit of a shame because there are some things that you can't do anymore. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sorry if I may have another one. You didn't talk much about them, but you mentioned the bad boys or the bad guys that you work with as well. So I was just wondering, do you just do that for Europe or even more locally? And perhaps if you could say a little bit about that, because I would imagine that they would come with much more of a strategy of their own and tell you that this is the genre and the topic and everything. But just a little bit about how that process works.
Basically, we hired by Warner Bros. We've been working for them for the past 5 years now. We're doing all the social media in Switzerland, in the French part of Switzerland. For a long time, they were also distributed 20th Century Fox, but now Fox got bought by Disney. So 3 months ago, we lost 50% of our revenue there. So it was a bit sad, because you can imagine that they pay a bit more than indie producers. So they're a bit like the cow that we're milking, basically, when it comes to how the business works. Basically, I think it's very fascinating, and that shows like the huge advantage that they have over indies, because of course they spend a lot of time defining their marketing strategy. They have a very clear marketing strategy. They have like 20 pages of marketing strategy that they send to everyone. So whenever we work on a film, we get a marketing strategy and we get a social media strategy. And then the idea is that you pick and choose for your own territory what appears to be the strongest. So, often they have quite open positionings or different options, and then you choose like based on your own, the needs of your own territory, what you want. And then they also have everything is centralized. So you have tons of different assets, different visuals and stuff like that, different videos that say, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Father's Day, Happy St. Patrick, Happy, and then you can adapt that to all different territories and things like that. So of course, when we're working on that, it's incredible because we have a huge number of assets that are available, and you just need like basic Photoshop skills to kind of adapt them to your own market. And you have a very clear strategy in place. So that's what I'm always trying to say to producers here. I'm trying to say, get inspired by what they do and try to kind of centralize as much as possible. Because I think as a producer, if you also if you have a strong marketing strategy in place, if you have stills that allow like different positionings, if you have like a well-written synopsis, and maybe you have a social media package, when you approach distributors, when you approach sales agents, you're also in a stronger position. And that also means that you are more in control of how your film is being promoted. Are we running out of time? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.